This is the Transcend in Life podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson, taking you from fear to freedom.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Transcend in Life. I have been looking forward to getting this next guest on for quite some time. Pat Quinn is a presentation coach who helps people share their message with the world. He is the founder of Storylink.com, a software tool that helps people capture and store their stories to create great presentations. Pat's a former professional magician, presentation coach for astronauts, Olympians, pastors, New York Times bestselling authors, and network television personalities, and coach of 4 national speak-off champions. Pat, that is quite a list. How you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Well, truly, it's my pleasure. And one thing that just sticks out to me, you do something that so many people are afraid of. One of the biggest fears is public speaking, and yet you do this so easily. Is this something that just came natural to you? Tell me kind of your story of getting into this.
Well, even though most people know me as a speaking coach or a presentation coach, I actually didn't get my start as a professional speaker. I got my start as a professional magician and worked magic for 10 years professionally. After that time, I realized I needed to get a real job, and so I became a public school teacher. I taught high school math for 10 years. During that time, I picked up an advanced degree in how adults learn. And so I really bring 2 things to the table. The first is a little bit of stagecraft from my years of doing magic. But the second is a real understanding of how someone who's listening to you, whether that's an audience of 50 people, an audience of 5 people on Zoom, or just one person on the phone or across the table at Starbucks, how that person hears you, how that person learns what you're saying, processes it, and responds to it. I've been fortunate, as I think you mentioned, to work with some really good household names, Damon John from Shark Tank, and Grant Cardone, and Michael Hyatt, and Tony Robbins, and Dean Graziosi on their KBB project. But most of the people that I work with every day are not professional speakers. Most of the people that I work with every day wouldn't even consider themselves speakers. Most of the people that I work with are business owners, entrepreneurs, CEOs, people who want to grow their business and attract new clients, create new revenue, but more importantly, have a bigger impact. And I believe that speaking is the best way to do that. The most cost-effective, the most predictable. Done correctly, speaking is the #1 marketing tool that any business, any nonprofit, any organization has to grow their impact and grow their revenue.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. You span a lot of industries at this point, what you're saying. Where did you come up with Storylink and this whole way to make it so much easier, if that's the correct terminology, to really produce an amazing, speech and really to be able to get that communication across?
For years, I had trouble keeping track of my stories. Like a lot of people who are listening to this, probably, you have lots of things happen to you. And you think a lot of times, oh, that would be really funny to talk about, or I could teach something with that, or that's a great story for this purpose. But how do you keep track of them? I used to write my stories on Post-it notes, on the back of receipts, on cocktail napkins, wherever I was when it happened, I would jot it down. I had a giant folder filled with these scraps of paper. And then one day somebody gave me a story journal. And I was like, oh, this is the answer. I filled it with stories. The problem was it wasn't always with me. Sometimes I'd be at work and my story journal would be at home. Sometimes I'd be in the car and my story journal wouldn't be with me. And so I jotted my stories down on Post-it notes and cocktail napkins and jammed them into my story journal. When I got my story journal, it was about 1 inch thick. And a few years later, my story journal was like 7 inches thick because it had all these other pieces of paper jammed in there. And I thought to myself, why isn't there one place in the cloud to store all of my stories? I have a place to store my photos. I have a place to store my music, but why isn't there a place to store my stories? And I looked all over for one, and I could not find one, so I made one. We made Storylink, STORYLINQ.com, one place to store all of your stories in the cloud, and it's easy to organize them because you store the stories by the type of story: happy stories, sad stories, good opening stories for a presentation, good selling stories, good teaching stories. Then anytime you need to speak or give a presentation or even have a conversation, a sales call, You just go to storylink.com, you choose the stories you want to tell that day, you push one button and it's all organized for you. You can even print out a script if that's what you want. By the way, during this whole process, I'm right there next to you because there's targeted teaching while you're entering the stories. There's targeted teaching, video teaching from me on exactly how to tell your story the very best way, the most effective way to get people to say yes to the next step of engagement with you. And so it's at storylink.com, STORYLINQ.com. And for listeners today, we want to offer a free 30-day trial. If you enter the discount code STORY, STORY, when you register, you'll get 30 days to try the tool for free. If you like it, enter a few stories. If you like it, if it works for you, if it's exactly what you said you needed, you can keep using it. If it doesn't work for you, you can cancel at any time and not pay anything. But storylink.com is really going to kick up your story game. One of the things we've noted is that businesses grow faster when the people involved in the business are telling the story of the business and using stories to connect with people and using stories to explain things to people. And so the more times you're telling your stories, the faster your business is going to grow. And we think storylink.com can be an integral part of that for any business and any person who has a message to share with the world.
Well, guys, and I've actually used Storylink. I've had a chance to work with Pat, and I will say it's remarkable how easy he really does make it. So check it out for sure. It's an amazing offer, and I certainly appreciate you doing that, Pat. The story idea, so it's more than just being entertaining. You're saying it's really to relate. It helps people. Can you explain why stories are so powerful? Because just like whenever I hear you talk, you'll say something and then you'll give a story and I'm captivated. What is it? Is there something this is just the way we're wired as human beings? I'm just curious what the purpose behind stories and great communication.
Well, the way that I help people is with a specific goal in mind. My goal is not that you would make people laugh or make people cry. My goal is not that you would get a standing ovation or have people come up to you afterwards and say, wow, that was an amazing story. My goal, my single measuring stick of success is that whoever you're speaking to would want to take the next step with you. That next step might be to become a customer. That next step might be to join your team. That next step might be to take something for free, schedule a free call, have an appointment, change their behavior, change their attitude, change their thoughts, whatever you want them to do next. My goal is that they would do that. And one of the things we've learned from the research is that if you just come in and start teaching, if you just come in and start selling, if you just come in and start talking about your products or services, that is not the best way to get someone to take the next step with you. Robert Cialdini's research talks about pacing and leading. Everybody wants to be a leader. We all want to lead people down the right path and lead people to a better future. But you can't lead until you pace. What's pacing? Pacing is just walking alongside someone saying, I get it. I've been in your shoes. I understand your pain. It's throwing your arm around them and saying, I dealt with this too. I know what you're dealing with. Everybody wants to be a leader, but you have to pace before you lead. And so the role of story and the initial role of story in any presentation or conversation is simply to connect. You have to connect with them before you can teach them, sell them, or convince them. And so the original purpose of story at the start of a presentation is to connect. That's the most important story that you will have.
So when you're watching people communicate, what do you think one of the biggest, challenges that people have? Because so often I'll see people lose their point, whether it's not being concise enough, maybe it's not being direct enough. What are you seeing out there, Pat, that people could really hone in on so they are communicating better?
Well, most people make this way too complicated. Telling a story is actually very simple. I'm going to teach you right now a 2.5-minute method to tell any story. You can tell any story in 2.5 minutes. If it's taking you longer than 2.5 minutes, you're doing it wrong. And you're probably losing customers, losing impact, losing revenue, losing connection because of it. We've all heard somebody tell a 2.5-minute story. The problem is it took them 25 minutes to tell the story. And we're distracted. We're thinking, how do I get out of here? We're checking our phone. We're checking our email. I want you to be able to tell the story in the most concise way, in the fewest words possible. So here it is in 2.5 minutes. There are 3 parts to a great story. The first part to a great story is what we call the before. You get 60 seconds to describe the before. What was your life like before? And now some people, when they're describing what their life was like before, they spend 20 minutes telling us every up and every down and every obstacle and every ache and pain. And you have to trim it down to 60 seconds. If it takes you longer than that, cut stuff. Prioritize. Pick the most important things and describe your life before in 60 seconds. Part 2 is the pivot. You get 30 seconds to describe the pivot. The pivot is when things change. The pivot is when you found something, discovered something, created something, started selling something, whatever it is the change. You get 30 seconds to describe the pivot, which brings us to part 3. Part 1 was the before, you get 60 seconds. Part 2 was the pivot, you get 30 seconds. And part 3 is the after, or the now. You get 60 seconds to describe your life now. And it's great to create a contrast with the before. So you can say, instead of being like this, I'm like this. Instead of being like this, I'm like this. Instead of being like this, I'm like this. So 60 seconds on before, 30 seconds on the pivot, 60 seconds on the after. Let's say I was going to tell you about my health. And I might say that 6 months ago, I was not that healthy. I was eating all day long and putting on weight. In the afternoon, I would lose energy. I'd have to take a nap every afternoon. I'd fall asleep at my desk because I was lacking so much energy. And the thing is, I wasn't sleeping that well at night. 60 seconds on the before. Then I discovered overnight oats. Overnight oatmeal is the greatest thing in the world. I make it at night and put it in the refrigerator. I have overnight oats for breakfast and lunch every day. That's my pivot. Now watch how I contrast with the beginning. Now today, instead of eating all day and gaining weight, I've actually lost 11 pounds. Instead of losing energy in the afternoon, I have steady energy all throughout the day. And instead of not sleeping well at night, I sleep like a baby. And there it is. In 2.5 minutes, I've told a compelling story. And if you do this correctly and your customers have the problem you described in the before, and your customers want the life that you described in the after, or the outcomes that you described in the after, they're going to come back to you and be like, tell me more about that pivot. I don't care if that's a financial services product, if it's a health product, I don't care if it's coaching, I don't care if it's an event, whatever it is, including nonprofits. Before, we used to have this problem that kids went to school without winter coats, and kids often would be cold at the bus stop, and kids would have this problem. Then we started this charity called Coats for Kids, or whatever we called our charity. Now today, instead of not having coats, every kid has a coat. Instead of sitting at the bus stop where they're really cold, they're not sitting there where it's really cold. It's the same method. Before, pivot, after. You are 2.5 minutes away from growing your business. You are 2.5 minutes away from having a bigger impact on other people. And I believe you are 2.5 minutes away from fulfilling the purpose of why you were put on earth, to help other people through your story.
You make it sound so easy, and you are clearly a gifted speaker. And some of the names you mentioned, my goodness, they're some of the greatest speakers we've seen. For those that don't feel that way and they get those butterflies and they're getting on stage, is it being prepared with this and just having this so lined out? Is there any other things that you can teach them that maybe would make them feel a little more at ease? I'm trying to, as an audience member, go, I don't like to public speak. I like to, but I know there's a lot of people out there that shudder at the thought of getting up in front of someone, but they have so many gifts to give. Do you have some other tips that could go along with that, Pat?
Absolutely. Let's start in the beginning with your story. A lot of people listening to this right now are probably sitting here thinking, I don't have a story like that. Like, you have an amazing story and you have an amazing story. And I go on YouTube and there's the amazing story. And I watch podcasts and there's an amazing story. And I go to conferences and, those people. I just don't have a story like that. And the first thing I want to tell you, if you're thinking that right now, your story is enough. You do not need to have story envy. It's actually better to have an ordinary story than an extraordinary story. I coach someone who has climbed to the top of Mount Everest. I coach 2 separate people, 2 astronauts who have been in space. And when they tell that story, when they tell a story of going into space, how many other people in the room can relate to that? Nobody else has done it. But I coach someone else who tells a story about arguing with their spouse about whether the toilet paper should come out over the top of the roll or under the bottom of the roll. Now, when they tell that story, how many other people can relate to that story? Every single person in the room. What if we judged our stories not based on how many people came up to us afterwards and said, that is an amazing story? What if instead we judged our stories based on how many people came up to us afterwards and said, that same thing happened to me? If your story is 1 in a million, you are going to help about 1 in a million people. But if your story is 1 in every household, you're going to help a lot of people have a greater impact and a much better business than the person with a 1 in a million story. And so do not have story envy. Do not wish your story was better or more amazing, because I know this, there's somebody out there right now struggling with the problem that you have already solved. And they don't need to hear it from an extraordinary person who doesn't look anything like them. They need to hear it from an ordinary person. They need to hear it from a normal person who looks just like them. It won't be the perfect story for everyone, but it'll be the perfect story for some people. And those are the people you were put on earth to help. And so don't have story envy. Second thing I'll throw in here is I just think a lot of people go on stage or take the microphone. Or this is true on sales calls too, by the way. Everything I say works if you get the opportunity to be on stage. It works if you get the opportunity to be online in front of a bunch of people, if you've got a big Facebook audience and you go live, or if you have a webinar. But it also works on Zoom calls. It works on phone calls. It works one-on-one across the desk with someone. And I think sometimes one of the problems people have is in their mind, they don't have clarity on 2 things. The biggest thing I think you need clarity on for this one is, what is the problem that I'm here to solve today? Here's the thing. If I go on stage and I think I need to be the smartest person in the room, even if it's just you and me in the room, I'm probably not the smartest person in the room. Like, I'm not the smartest person in a 2-person room. My wife will be the first person to tell you I'm not the smartest person at the table when her and I are having dinner together. So I'm never the smartest person in the room. And if I have to be, to have credibility, to feel good about my story, to feel credible, I'm always going to be nervous. I'm always going to have butterflies, and I'm always going to be nervous and stammering and worried about what I'm saying. But I don't have to be the smartest person in the room. All I have to do is have clarity on the problem that I'm here to solve today for this audience, whether it's 1 person on the phone or 50 people in a room. I don't have to know the answer to all of their questions. I don't have to solve all of their problems, and I don't need to be the smartest person in the room. There is one problem that I'm pretty good at solving for people. There's one problem that I have solved for myself, and I can solve it for others. And as long as the topic is that topic, as long as that's the problem I'm here to talk about today, I'm going to be much less nervous. I'm going to be much more comfortable. And that's going to show in everything I do. And so I think sometimes people don't feel credible. I think sometimes people don't feel worthy. And that's because they think they have to be the smartest person in the room. But narrow your scope, narrow your focus. We call it getting clarity on the problem that you solve. And you're going to have a much better chance of having the confidence, of having the presence, of having the presentation that will actually move people to the next step.
I really like that with the story, especially the way you said that. It makes so much sense. It's like, yeah, who could relate to going to the moon? Very few people who've ever walked the earth. But yeah, the toilet paper or, toothpaste or something along those lines, everybody can. In terms of preparation, and what do you suggest in terms of whether it's note cards or props or whatever, if they are going up to present their best? How do you get people to prepare? Because you've literally coached 4 national speak-off champions. What's that preparation look like?
My core mantra is this: low stakes practice before high stakes opportunities. Low stakes practice before high stakes opportunities. The number one reason why most people don't tell their story? The number one reason why most people don't tell their story is because it's not perfect yet. If you wait until your story is perfect, you will never tell it. So let's get it out of the way. Go tell someone your story today, and it'll be terrible. Go do it again tomorrow, and it'll be bad. Go do it again the next day, and it'll be irritating. Go do it. I'll tell you, on day 1, it's bad. On day 2, it's bad, but you have to do it anyway. On day 5, it's passable. On day 10, it's mediocre. But on day 50, you have that story. On day 100, you are an amazing storyteller, moving people, impacting people, changing lives, and growing your business because you've told it. But you can't get to, everybody wants to start on day 100. And part of that's because we watch people who are pretty polished speakers. And so one day you're going to have a great opportunity. One day you're going to have a conversation with somebody who can change your world. You're going to have somebody who can open doors for you, be an influencer for you, connect you to the right people, or maybe just become your biggest customer for the next 10 years. I hope the day that you have that opportunity, it's not the first time you're telling that story. I remember the first time I met Tony Robbins. I was in Miami. I was at his studio. I hadn't met him before, but I was speaking at one of his events. And he walked in and he like fills the doorway so the sun goes under. And it's like darker because he's standing in the doorway. I'm a big guy. I'm 6'6" tall, but Tony is mammoth. And he walks right up to me and he sticks out his giant hand. And I've got a big hand. I'm big. I'm 6'6". But he just engulfs my hand in his giant hand, shakes my hand, looks me right in my eyes. He just pierces like right through. His stare in person is just like crazy intense. He looks right at me and says, "I don't know your story. Tell me about you." And I'm telling you, you got like 2.5 minutes right there. And that better not be the first time that you've told your story. For people listening to this, it might not be Tony Robbins. That might not be the ultimate connector for you. But you will have an opportunity in front of someone or some audience. And in that audience will be the person who can open the perfect door for you, will be the connector who can make the right phone call for you, the influencer who can change your life with one mention of you, or maybe just a big customer that can keep you afloat until things take off. I hope when that opportunity happens to you, it's not the first time you tell your story. I think there's one metric that most businesses miss. I know businesses that keep track of revenue and they keep track of customers and churn and all this stuff. Everybody has these numbers that they keep track of. Here's the number that matters to me. How many times this week did you tell your story? There's 7 days in a week. I think a good goal for 2021 would be to tell your story 7 times each week. Tell your story to new people 7 times each week. 1 new person, 10 new people, I don't care. But I tell you, if you get to Friday and you haven't told your story 7 times, I guess we know what you're doing this weekend. You're finding new people to tell you. And you can do that on social media. You can do that through networking. You can do that through all the things that you do to get the word out. But how many times are you telling your story? Because here's what I know. The more times a business is telling its story, the faster that business is growing. This is the way to grow your business. Tell your story more often.
So you have this giant man piercing through you, coming to say, "I don't know your story." And because you've told it so many times, did you just rattle it off and it just went seamlessly? I'm just curious at this point.
I got nervous and really blew it that day, but no, I'm just kidding. I did what I'd done hundreds of times before, which is just to tell my story. I have a story of a business that my business wasn't growing. I was frustrated because we'd created the perfect product. We spent a year creating the perfect product. And we just weren't growing at the rate that we thought. And we got really frustrated because we were at an exhibition hall at a conference across the hall or across the aisle from somebody who had a similar product that was nowhere near as good as ours. He did not have near the background that we had. He didn't have the connections or the financing that we had. And he was just killing us. Everybody was going to him. He got 10 times the business out of that conference that we did, and his business was growing at a rate 20 times larger than ours was. We went home that night and we were angry, but sometimes angry gets you to the point of changing what you're doing. And we're like, what is he doing that we are not doing? And the answer was, he was telling a story better than we were telling our story. And so we didn't make up a story. We didn't, script like, go to a script writer to write a story. We just authentically and transparently told our story of what was going on. And from that point on, that was a turning point in our business because we were telling a better story. And that made all the difference in the world. We eventually grew larger than that person and acquired that person, acquired that company. We went to the same conference a year later and had the largest booth at the conference, and our business was never the same after we made that singular decision to start telling our story differently. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this, because I know the difference it can make in a startup. I know the difference it can make in an existing business that's trying to grow, and even in very established businesses, they have to remember their stories and keep telling their stories.
Yeah, I almost got chills just listening to it, because we talk about fear to freedom on this podcast, and we talk a lot about failure. And it wasn't necessarily that you're failing, but you weren't succeeding to the level of your expectation. But you took it as a learning moment, and it's obviously you figured it out. Uh, you've mentioned something before, and you've said maybe we should base our story based on the questions they're asking back. So are you constantly asking for feedback from your audience members to know how your story is hitting them, good, bad, or indifferent?
If you're in the room with somebody or you're on Zoom, I don't think you absolutely have to. The purpose, you don't have to ask for feedback that often. Remember, I don't tell long stories. I tell 2.5-minute stories. So if you're going to stand up and talk for an hour and you're not going to give the audience a chance to talk back or a chance to participate, I think you're probably doing it wrong. But if you're just telling a quick story, and you have a visual on the person, so you're in the room with them or you're on Zoom somehow, I don't think you actually need to ask for feedback. Here's the thing. The purpose of your first story out of the chute, when you're meeting a new customer or you're meeting somebody new for the first time, saying, I don't know you, tell me about you. The purpose of the opening story is to connect. It is very easy to tell if you are connecting. The person who you're speaking to will be nodding their head and leaning into you. If they're not nodding their head and leaning in, and this works online as well as it works in person, when I'm telling something that the person who I'm talking to is like, been there, done that, I get it, good job, Pat. Or I was there too. I know exactly. I've been in that exhibition hall where everybody else's booth is crowded and my booth isn't. I get it. You will be nodding your head and you will be leaning in. Happens at Starbucks, happens in an audience of 1,000 people. I see it. You just watch for that. If you're telling a story and the person sitting across from you is leaning back like this and you're thinking, oh, good, they're getting comfortable. No, they're not. They're disengaging from you. And so pivot, change your story. There's what we call universal connectors. Universal connectors are things that they don't necessarily have anything to do with your business, but they're just connection points. Children and parents are universal connection points because a lot of people have children and a lot of people have parents. The weather and geography are universal connection points. I'm in Wisconsin where we got 9 inches of snow today and it's like 8 degrees outside. And everybody in those areas are nodding their heads right now. And everybody in warm areas are nodding their heads right now, saying, I'm glad I don't live in Wisconsin. It's a universal connection point. Geography and weather is a universal connection point. At certain times of the year, football is a universal connection point. We aren't going to talk about the Green Bay Packers, but it's what's happening. We're right now, we're recording this right around the Super Bowl time. It's like a universal connection point right now in our country. It's not always, sometimes it is, and it's not for everybody. But here's what I'm going to get on a sales call. I want to know about that person. I'll creep on them, as my kids would say. I'll go do some social media research on them. I want to find something out about them and find, oh, you went to this university. I went to that university. Universal connection point. Oh, you've got kids in college. I have kids in college. Universal connection point. Oh, I see this picture of you fly fishing. I could bring up fly fishing. Universal connection point. The more you know about somebody, the more easy it is to get them to nod their head and lean into you. And that's your goal. That's the key to engagement. That's the key to getting them to listen to the rest of what you have to say. But I'll tell you, they're going to make their buying decision not based on who has the best product. They're going to make their buying decision not based on who has the best PowerPoint. They're going to make that buying decision based on that first 2.5 minutes because you both went to the same college or you both fly fish it's crazy. If you watch how the brain makes decisions, it doesn't learn, it doesn't get sold until it has that connection. But once it has that connection, it allows itself to get sold. If you have somebody who likes you, they may have at one point said, you go ahead and sell me on this. They're inviting you in to sell them on this, as compared to somebody who you don't have a connection with that sits there the whole time and is like, I dare you to sell me on this. They won't even engage in the process with you. What's the difference? The difference is the opening 2.5 minutes. You either connected or you didn't. And sometimes that difference is the research you've done. Sometimes you just don't know, which is why you go to your universal connection point. I was on the phone with my parents last night, or I was talking to my kids yesterday, and you see if you get a nod out of them. You're just checking. But there's a visual. I don't think, unless you're on a phone call where you're like, can't see the other person, then you can listen for some verbal feedback. But or if you're speaking to a large audience for a longer time, you might want to have them give some feedback in certain ways. We use chat on Zoom and things like that. But most of the time you can do it just by body language. You should be connecting in that first 2.5 minutes. If you're not, there's not a lot you can do in the second half of a presentation that will make up for not connecting in the first half of the presentation.
Well, for those of you not watching, I'm nodding my head with Pat the whole time, so he's clearly connecting with me. You had mentioned,
by the way, if you wouldn't be nodding your head, I'd be changing my answers. Well, because I would quickly recognize that the stories I'm telling aren't resonating with you, and I assume your audience then. If you're not nodding your head, then I'm telling the wrong stories. And so I'll stop telling stories about these things and start telling stories about other things, trying to find what makes you nod your head. I mean, you have to be able to be flexible enough. In the beginning, you're just trying to get one good story. I mean, in the beginning, if you're a solopreneur, an entrepreneur, or you haven't done a lot of this, you just got to get one good Genesis story, one good founding story, one good story about why you're doing this. But once you get a little practiced at this, once you've told it a few times, every story is multidimensional. Every story is multifaceted, and you will highlight the parts of your story that will connect with the people that you're speaking to. And so you'll get better and better at this, and you'll get more and more flexible, and you'll be able to pivot if you're going down a route. And really good salespeople do this all the time. They're going down the route selling on one set of features, and they realize it's not resonating, and they realize the buyer actually has a different buyer criteria. So they pivot and they start talking about a different set. Well, the same is true with storytelling. You're trying to connect on this point and you don't, so you pivot and you try to connect on this point. And that's what a flexible storyteller does. And that's what the real pros do.
Well, he even did it without me realizing. He goes, I was talking to my parents. He was just giving an example. And I was like, oh, yeah, I just talked to my parents. It's so funny. You mentioned Robert Cialdini earlier today. What are 2 or 3 of the most impactful books for you that have really impacted your speaking, your professional career, Pat? Because I know you're well-read. You clearly have just done some amazing things. We like to give out some great tips on some books that have really impacted people in their careers.
Yeah. So the preeminent book that I think everybody should start with is Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. It's one of 2 books that sits on my nightstand at all times. I read it about every 6 months. It goes through the 6 or 7 areas that cause people to make decisions and how you can use them to best tell stories and create presentations that work. One of the books that I love is Daniel Pink's book, To Sell is Human. And if you want to be a better connector, if you want to be a better one-on-one presenter on the phone and on Zoom and across the table, across the desk from somebody, Daniel Pink's book, To Sell is Human, is absolutely, it's one of the great ones. And then a third one that probably a lot of people may not have heard of, Scott Adams is the illustrator of Dilbert, or the author of the comic strip Dilbert. He gets a little political sometimes, but he has an amazing book called Win Bigly. Now, it's a little political, but if you take the politics out of it, Win Bigly is a step-by-step book of exactly how to get people to take the next step with you. It's a master class. And take the politics out of it. Just focus on the techniques that he is laying out. He numbers them. He numbers the technique, so you can skip ahead to the next one and just follow these numbers and do these things when you speak, and you're going to be a better communicator. You're going to be better at getting people to follow your steps, and you're going to have a bigger impact on the world. So those are 3 books that I think are really good.
Well, influences certainly, and I actually just recently picked up Persuasion, so I'm into Cialdini. I think he's really good. I want to ask you, this is the big question that we love to ask all our guests. What is freedom? What does that word mean to you, Pat? Because again, you've done some incredible things. You've influenced so many people. What does that mean for you in your life?
To me, freedom means that you get to not only tell your own story, but you get to write your own story. And so one of them's looking back and one of them's looking forward. And so let's go back first. When you're looking back, I don't want you to be ashamed of your story. To me, true freedom is to be surrounded by people, working with people, and interacting every day with people who will just accept your story. You don't have to hide it. You don't have to magnify it. I go to conferences all the time. You probably do too, where it's like, oh, I just had a $1 million product launch. And the person you're talking to has to at that point say, well, I just had a $2 million product launch. And then somebody over here has to come in. And if they come in and say, well, my last product launch flopped, like they'll be voted off the island. They have to say, I have a 3 million. I just hate events like that because there's just this boasting pressure. I just want to be able to tell my story. We struggled in my first company. We created a great product and we didn't sell any of it. We were engineers in a room designing without any customer support, and we didn't have a good without any customer input, and we didn't have a good story. It was terrible. I just want to be able to tell that story unapologetically and say we learned from that, but it kind of sucked at the time. And there's some things I'm good at, and there's things I'm bad at. I'm an introvert, and a lot of people who are introverts are like they don't want to tell their story because if somebody finds out they're an introvert, like, oh my word. Like all the extroverts are out there saying, I'm not an introvert. But the introverts are like, finally, somebody like us. I want you to be able to unapologetically tell your story without being ashamed of it. It is a good enough story. You are worthy. And then going forward, I want true freedom to me is the ability to write your own story, to not feel like someone else is controlling your story, to not feel like you don't have control over what the next chapter is. And that can look a lot of different ways in people's lives, but I hope that everybody gets to a point in their life where they can look back and just tell their story unapologetically, and the people that they're with will love them regardless of that story, and the people that they work with and spend time with are like, that's your story, that's part of you, but like, that's okay. And then you can look forward and say, I'm writing the next chapter. It's not being written for me. It's not being forced on me. I get to write the next chapter. I get to choose. And I think if you can have those two things, if you can tell your story and write your own story, that's true freedom to me.
I love it. Love the answer. What should I have asked you that I just didn't know enough to ask, Pat, that you're like, I got to get this to the audience before we close this thing up?
What stops people from being boring?
All right. What stops people from being boring?
I think what stops people from being boring is what some speakers do. Let me put it this way. What some speakers do that other people don't is create contrasts. I think great speakers create great contrasts. And so let me talk about first the emotional line of your story, and then I'll give you 3 tools that you can use to create a great contrast. Every story has an emotional line. When things are going bad and your business is going down, or in my health story, when I'm not eating healthy and I'm not sleeping at night, that's the emotional line of my story going down. And then every story probably has an emotional line that goes up at some point. Like when my business takes off and we squash that other guy, like my business, that's a good line. That's a good, the emotional line's going up. And when I'm losing weight and I'm sleeping well, that my emotional line's going up. So every story has an emotional line. Sometimes they're going up and sometimes they're going down. How do you create great contrast? I'm going to give you 3 tools. The first tool you have is the pace of your speaking. And it's a simple rule, very simple rule. When the emotional line of the story is going down, the pace of your speaking should go down. And when the emotional line of your story picks up and things start to get better, the pace of your speaking should pick up and go up because things are getting better. The second tool that you have is your volume. And the rule is really simple. When the emotional line of your story is going down, your volume should go down. And when the emotional line of your story turns up and things start getting better and your world starts getting better and things start to be successful, not only should your pace pick up, but your volume should pick up as well. And so that's 2 tools. You have your pace, you have your volume, and then you have your tone. And I want your tone at the end of each sentence. When the emotional line of your story is going down, you should finish your phrases and your sentences with your tone turning down. But when the story turns, the emotional line of your story starts to go up, you should finish your phrases and sentences with your voice going up. Not going up like, are you sure about that? But going up like, I'm excited about that. So you can actually have somebody following along with your story, even if they don't speak your language. You could be speaking like Charlie Brown's teacher, and you should still be able to tell the story. Wah, 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 wah. Wah, 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 wah. Wah, 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 wah. And like everybody knows the story. And so what we're trying to do here is make it really easy for the person you're listening to pay attention and come along for the emotional ride with you. And if you do that, they're going to be connected to you. They're going to be wanting to do business with you, and they're going to become your huge advocates in the world. If you don't do that, they're going to be distracted. They're going to glaze over. They're going to lean back, and you lost the connection, which means you also lost the sale, which means you also lost the impact that you could have been having on that person's life. And so I want great speakers to create contrast. You've got 3 tools to do that: your pace, your volume, and your tone. And you want to use those every opportunity that you get.
Guys, he is truly a pro. Pat, how can our listeners connect with you online and really get to know more about how to become a pro the way you are when it comes to speaking and just communicating in general?
The best way to do that is through storylink.com, STORYLINQ.com. And storylink.com has great training. You can sign for a free 30-day trial with the coupon or the discount code STORY, and then you'll be able to access all the free training from me. You'll be able to connect with me there. You'll be able to enter your stories, store and capture and organize your stories. Check it out for 30 days. I think it's going to be a great tool that's going to help you grow your influence, grow your revenue, but most importantly, grow the impact that you have on the lives of other people.
And guys, we'll make sure and put all those in the show notes so you know exactly how to get to it. I've done it. Trust me, you will get a ton out of it. Pat, I so appreciate your time, what you bring to the world, all your energy and knowledge. It was an amazing 45 minutes or so. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot. Just keep doing what you do. And most importantly, just keep telling your story.
You guys, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And until next time, make sure to go to letsgowin.com where you have the free work-life balance form available to you. I take it at least once a month to check in, make sure I'm staying in check with all my areas of life so I don't get out of balance. Until then, we'll see you next week. Transcendent Life. Thank you so much for listening. If this content is delivering value to you, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review us. That helps us build this community, and that is what we are all about. Building this community as big as we can, helping as many people as we can, and deliver as much value as possible. Be sure to head over to transcendentlifepodcast.com for information on my coaching courses, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Let's Go Win 365. Let's go win and transcend in life.
This is the Transcend in Life podcast with your host, J.M. Ryerson, taking you from fear to freedom.